It's now pleased to recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to address the issue of the impact of fire suppression on the Forest Service's budget. Since the early 90s, wildfire suppression has ballooned from 13% of the Forest Service's budget to over 50% today. Wildfire prevention funding has been shown to be much more cost-effective than wildfire suppression in combating future wildfires. Yet, because of the soaring costs of fire suppression, over $1 billion has been robbed from prevention and other conservation programs over the past 2 years. In fact, since 2002, the costs of fire suppression have exceeded the appropriated funding levels 11 times. Currently, the U.S. Forest Service is the only agency that is required to address natural disasters out of their appropriated budget. All other natural disaster response is funded through the disaster cap, which allows agencies to maintain normal operations in the event of a natural disaster. 1% of wildfires account for 30% of wildfire suppression costs. These catastrophic wildfires are truly natural disasters and should be addressed as such. Mr. Friedman, you've already said that you do support H.R. 167, the Wildlife Disaster Funding Act, which would provide for a disaster cap adjustment to fund the response to large wildfires. But I'd like to hear from the other panelists. Do you support that act?
Thank you, Ranking Member Tsongas. Absolutely, it's part of our policy principles. We think that something around that, whether it's that specific bill or not, is absolutely required. We've seen that effect with our local forests, beginning projects and then having to stop them because they've had to transfer funds to these wildfire mitigation efforts.
The Intertribal Timber Council also supports the disaster cap and moving in that direction. I think it's really important that those funds that go to actually do implementation on the ground, and the movement moves it towards fire, and so you create a fire industry instead of creating the type of industry to deal with it, and I think those things are really important.
Ms. Lozdick.
As a university, we don't take positions on bills, but I will say that this report that you all have validates the need that preventative treatments lead to more cost and ecological efficiency.
So if funding were freed up to invest in that through this act, that would make a difference. Thank you all. Following on, I wanted to just talk about the multiple use principles that the Forest Service is guided by. Our national forests are a public good. They provide clean water, clean drinking water, clean air, wildlife habitat, and open space where we can recreate and relax. Federal law requires that national forests be managed for multiple uses, which includes the promotion of outdoor recreation and the long-term viability of ecosystems, not just timber harvest. This is a different mandate than state and private forest land. Our national forests are a national treasure and part of our public heritage. Our forests absorb approximately 12% of the country's carbon emissions. In addition, 20% of the nation's water supply, and this is to reiterate my opening statement, but I think it's important, comes from national forests, but over 30% of the West, 50% of the West, providing clean drinking water to over 60 million Americans. Mr. Friedman, how well do you believe the Forest Service is managing its multiple use mandate?
I think it's getting better, Congresswoman. There's a lot of changes in the West. 30 years ago, we had probably 3 to 10 times as many sawmills and timber mills as we have today, while today's mills have 25% more milling capacity than in those days and are concentrated in particular transportation hubs. So we have to diversify our economies because timber can't carry the freight in rural communities. So diversifying includes the recreation benefits that you described, and hunting and other ways that we utilize the forest. Back in those days, we used to argue about below-cost timber sales and the way we subsidized the Forest Service to do one set of things that benefited an industry. Today, we're trying to subsidize the agency to do effective restoration work to provide multiple benefits rather than just the logs.
And so do you believe that they are adequately balancing the many competing demands?
It can always get better, but I think it's headed in the right direction as a long-term trend.
Thank you, Mr. Friedman. I yield back.
Mr. Rigdon, the